Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martino Stierli. I'm the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design here at MoMA, and I would like to give you a very warm welcome to tonight's program, which marks the beginning of a 3-day, 2-city symposium to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Robert Venturi's Untitled Manifesto, which was first published with MoMA in association with the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts in Chicago, and which, as you all know, remains in print to the present day. Our conference is a collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania and has been conceptualized with Penn's Shapiro Weizenhofer Professor of the History of Art, David Brownlee, who will join me here in just a few seconds to also give his welcome. Complexity and contradiction in architecture probably does not need a special introduction to this audience, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. It is universally seen as one of the most seminal pieces of architectural theory of the past few decades, a status predicted already by architectural historian Vincent Scully in his original introduction to the book 50 years ago. When David and I first started thinking of celebrating this anniversary almost 2 years ago, we were guided by two main questions. First, what, if at all, is the relevance of Venturi's treatise for contemporary architectural thinking? Has the book in the meantime merely become a part of history, or does it still inform the thinking of a young generation of architects active today? The Architects Roundtable that we have assembled and that will be moderated by David DeLong from the University of Pennsylvania will revolve around this question. Secondly, given all the scholarly research and publications that have considered the significance of complexity and contradiction over the past 5 decades, is it still possible to look at this Untitled Manifesto with fresh eyes and to produce new insight that is relevant from today's perspective? The 3 paper sessions tomorrow and on Saturday will present some new research on an old friend that we hope will launch a productive conversation on this question from 3 different points of view. 1, the problem, as it were, of the relationship of complexity and contradiction to postmodernism and its historiography. 2, the creative, institutional, and sociological contexts in which Venturi operated. And finally, the very making of the book and the various iterations the manuscript underwent. I would like to thank David Brownlee for sharing my enthusiasm for celebrating this anniversary and for the many interesting conversations along the way that helped us shape this conversation. Thanks also to Bill Whitaker from the Architectural Archives at the University of Pennsylvania, not only for opening up the vault and for making research material available to all of us, but also for his key role in getting access to some houses that we will be visiting on our bus tour on Saturday afternoon in Philadelphia. Paul Savage, Dan Macy, and David Lockhart will very generously grant us access to their homes, among them the Escherick House by Louis Kahn and the Vanna Venturi House by, obviously, Robert Venturi, for which I would like to extend a special thank you. A very special thanks also to Denise Scott-Brown, who has very graciously agreed to be part of a conversation with Bill Whitaker that afternoon, which will highlight her own recollections of the intellectual genesis of complexity and contradiction. I would also like to thank Brett Taboda and the entire team of the Department of Architecture and Design who have been and are continuing to work in the background to make this complex event a success. My sincere thanks also to Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown, who are in the audience with us tonight, whose generous financial support has made this conference possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank all of our speakers and moderators from near and afar for making it to New York tonight and for sharing their thoughts and insights with us over the next few days. And finally, before turning over to David Brownlee, I wanted to point out that our program tonight will be live streamed and can be accessed on MoMA's website, allowing all of those who didn't make it here tonight to be present remotely. Thank you very much and welcome again.
I'm David Brownlee, and I join Martino in welcoming all of you, welcoming our wonderful several sets of panels of speakers, and all of you who are interested in unraveling things that are complex and contradictory at a moment that does feel rather complicated. What we have planned to do is, I think, a celebration of collaboration. And I want to thank Martino especially for being a wonderful collaborator and colleague in this project. I want to thank also, as he did, his wonderful colleague, Brett Taboada, who has been I think it is fair to say, the organizational genius behind the complexity and the contradiction, keeping it sorted out. At Penn, I also want to thank Bill Whitaker and Leanne Custer, who have worked together to create a terrific exhibition at Penn, open now, that those who come to Philadelphia on Saturday will be able to see, an exhibition that tells the story of the making of the book. It's called Back Matter, the making of Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. I want to thank my colleagues at Penn for supporting this endeavor, the deans of the School of Arts and Sciences, the dean of the School of Design, the provost of the university, and I want to especially thank Keith and Kathy Sachs for their support of contemporary art at Penn. And again, I also want to thank the very generous homeowners who are letting us into their homes on Saturday afternoon. I'm pretty sure that Robert Venturi did not think that he was writing a book about civics when he wrote Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. But reading his gentle manifesto this week, I think we should be reminded that almost everything that we say about architecture is a statement about human life. Listen to these familiar words again. I like complexity and contradiction. I speak of a complex and contradictory architecture based on the richness and ambiguity of modern experience. But an architecture of complexity and contradiction has a special obligation toward the whole. Its truth must be in its totality, or its implications of totality. It must embody the difficult unity of inclusion rather than the rather easy unity of exclusion. More is not less. I look forward very much to spending the next 3 days with architect colleagues and historian colleagues. I look forward to working collaboratively with women and men and with colleagues from around the world. I think that at least a little piece of the difficult whole is within our grasp every day, and this evening too. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to David DeLong, Professor of Architecture. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to turn it over to Sarah Gerda from the Graham Foundation.
Hi, I'm Sarah Herda. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to mark the 50th anniversary of the publication of Complexity and Contradiction, a project that changed architectural discourse and continues to circulate, I think, in the field today, as which we'll see unfold on the panel tonight and throughout the following days. 60 years ago, this year, the Graham Foundation was founded in 1956 and began its support of individuals, awarding fellowships to architects and artists to pursue independent study and scholarship. In 1961, Robert Venturi submitted a proposal to the Graham's then director, John Intenza, for consideration. More than a year later, Venturi received a fellowship to work on the project that would become Complexity and Contradiction. Venturi managed to finish the manuscript despite the pulls of his teaching schedule and demands of his architectural practice, which he reiterates in letters to Intenza, telling him why he's not done with the project yet. But then what? In 1963, Arthur Drexler began discussing the idea to create a new publication series at MoMA with Intenza to be produced with major support from the foundation. Drexler used Venturi's recently completed project as an example for the need for this new publication series. Venturi's manuscript should be published, but by whom, Drexler asked. The proposed Papers in Architecture series, which intended to continue the discussion and development of ideas, as Drexler wrote, was the answer, and the book was published 3 years later. Complexity and Contradiction is a seminal project in the Foundation's history. It demonstrates the need to support individuals directly to develop the ideas that shape architectural discourse, an imperative that is as urgent today as it was over 50 years ago. The book is also a project we think of often when we make new grants each year. It is difficult to imagine what architectural discourse over the past several decades would have been like if Complexity and Contradiction never had been published. Attempting it, however, is helpful in reminding us of the enormous impact a new idea can have on the field, and it reveals how important the collaborations and institutional partnerships are that give new ideas a public platform. Thank you.
And now to David DeLong, who will moderate the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
I think that the speakers should include architects in the So thank you for the introductions. It's good to be here. When I was a student of Lucan's at the University of Pennsylvania, Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown provided a welcome sense of relief from the rigors of the studio. I first met Bob in the spring of 1963 in his office, and he walked me through the manuscript of Complexity and Contradiction, page by page, and the illustrations were bigger than they are in the book. As he spoke, he made reference to the models of his mother's house behind him, because the book is very much about the making of architecture, as Scully was later to say in his introduction. And Bob himself wrote in the book that he wrote as an architect rather than a scholar. So it seems fitting that we begin this symposium with a panel of architects representing a younger generation to see what impact the book may have had. Stephen Kieran of KieranTimberlake Architects, Philadelphia, Michael Meredith of MOS Architects, New York City, Sam Jacob of Sam Jacob Studio, London, Kersten Geers of Geers von Severen, Brussels, Momoyo Kaijima of Atelier Bow-Wow, Tokyo, and concluding with James Timberlake of KieranTimberlake Architects, Philadelphia. Now, a word about the format. Our time is rather constricted, and we want to open up a possibility for questions from the audience. So I'm hoping that after each question is asked, each of you responds in around 5 or 6 minutes so that we can get through. 6 times 5 is 30, and I'd like to have you ask questions of each other at the end of those responses, and I'd like to get to 2 questions if we have time. So I'm going to ask each of them to say a few words about themselves as a lead-in to the first and obvious question: how might complexity and contradiction in architecture have affected your own practice, and how might it have affected the practice of others? And we'll begin with Steve Kieran.
Good evening, all. A brief introduction. James and I are bracketing the ends of this group. I'm not quite sure why, but probably just to keep us apart and separated. And also we, I believe, are the only people here who've worked for Bob and Denise, and I think that's correct. Is that
I
right?
intend to use bookends to this
Okay.
discussion.
All right, so we will bookend the discussion, but James and I were both graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1970s, and during that time we began to work for Bob and Denise to earn some semblance of a living and to get to know them, and they were certainly the people to work for in Philadelphia when we were there, and as graduate students. So we began to work then and then worked afterwards, really almost up till the time we founded our own firm in 1984. So they are very much mentors to us, and I think a lot of what we have to offer is in that context of young architects coming into the profession and learning from Bob Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, John Rauch, and others at that firm. 3 quick thoughts about what they meant to us in terms of how we began to formulate our own practice. The first one, I think, has to do with the agenda of the book, fundamentally. And there are lots of agendas, and lots of people can take different thoughts out of those agendas. But for us, as young architects starting a practice, having worked for them, a key one that was articulated in the book, and that we both certainly knew about and read when we were first becoming interested in architecture, had to do with the fundamental urban agenda in the book. That we were coming from a time in the 1950s of mid-century modern architecture, and there was an agenda in this book that was in no way related to a vision of an ideal city, be it a Renaissance city or an early or even mid-century modern city, but rather of a contextual city. A city that was about conversations with things that already existed, with the history of cities that were, rather than necessarily the generation of cities that didn't engage in those sorts of conversations. So that became, I think, huge for us and seminal in terms of how we thought about architecture then and continue to think about architecture today, very much in response and in dialogue with what we find on sites in cities and out of cities. So that's a kind of theoretical underpinning of the book that we certainly carry with us to this day. Secondly, there's inherent in that vision of the world as a contextual response is the notion that you then have to go look at the world and find a way to record the world and look at it really carefully and be an observer, and in the process of observing, learn how to do research, serious research about what we are going to be intervening in. And that's a skill that we certainly took from them and learned from them and carry with us very much to this day. Is, and in their particular instance, the research was often urban research. Things like learning from Las Vegas were efforts subsequent to Complexity and Contradiction to really look seriously at a place and document it, observe it, and then intervene. So that's something we carried with us, and along with that, the obligation to write, to actually not just build, but also write, that it's not good enough to just build the buildings. It's critical to also write, theorize, record, observe, describe your processes, describe how you think. So that was a second aspect that is very much central to our practice to this day. And lastly, there's the type of projects I think that we wound up engaging with as young architects and continue to engage in today are very different than what would have preceded Complexity and Contradiction in architecture. Mainly the work in the 1950s, the mid-century modern work. And I remember encountering it as a very young college student when I started to first become interested in architecture. My first thoughts about it were they're all buildings, and they're all depicted as single artifacts, what Vincent Scully at the time referred to as really heroic visions of architecture as independent. And we wound up working on the opposite set of projects in a lot of ways. We do lots of new buildings that are standalone, but very much within contextual situations. We do certainly lots of work in and about old buildings, renovating them, adding on to and expanding them. We do lots of planning work, and there was an expansion of the agendas of us as young architects that we really saw in them and that really continue to inform what we do, not just how we go about thinking about it and the underpinning of the theoretical agenda. So.
Thank you. Michael Meredith, we moved to New York, and Meredith.
I unfortunately prepared something, so I'm just going to try to do it really within 5 minutes. So the influence of Complexity and Contradiction, I would say, just is simply everywhere in our work. I think its tone is really important to think about. It's both academic and in sort of a casual personal tone. I like complexity. I like is like what we were taught in school never to say. It's simultaneously establishes and flattens positions. It's sort of the both and. It's the acceptance of the world and starting with the world at large as the place to start, I think is really important for us. And it's the deadpan point of view, sort of surfing between styles, history, and the contemporary, Gladio and pop, etc. So like a lot of, I think, probably for us who really don't know Bob and Denise, I mean, sort of from afar, and weren't there and didn't work for them. So the first way that sort of growing up in, let's say, the late 80s, the first experience of complexity and contradiction is sort of through the bad copies of their work, before we know the authors. It's sort of inseparable in my mind with a kind of Reagan-era milieu, Reaganomics, etc. It just happened. It's an experience that, as a student, it makes you skeptical of its politics, and people like Hal Foster have written about this a little bit in some of his texts. So how do we? So it raises a question for me about complexity and contradiction and its role today. How do we assess it? How do we assess this? Is this acceptance of the world, or starting with the world, potentially a problem nowadays? Is the deadpan, the indifference, inclusivity, expressionlessness? He spends a lot of time talking about anti-expressionism. Is that this calculated ambiguity of expression, etc.? Is it? How do we assess it? So I'm going to try to do it really quickly. So when looking at CNC, let's say, I think for me, one of the things that's important is you go through, I had charts that got sort of edited out for, I think, for everybody's benefit, but when you look at the illustrations, there's like there's a ton of architecture, a sea of it, an ocean of it, and then there's 5 artists that are represented. There's Johns, Kelly, Rauschenberg, Morris Lewis, and Piero della Francesco. And for me, that was a bridge to sort of move from Johns towards, and even if Johns and Venturi for me are very close. If you even look at like the Grand restaurant, the stencil work of Johns, it seems very like direct. And even the flag paintings of Venturi, including iconography, etc., super direct relationship between the two. And so that led to a sort of 1977 Artforum article called Aesthetics of Indifference by critic Maura Roth. And her argument is that out of a kind of moment of extreme politics, McCarthy-era politics, sort of 2 attitudes mapped out the poles of national consciousness, sort of bigoted, overzealous conviction and embittered passivity. And she illustrates it with Mickey Spillane's My Camera and J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield. And her argument is that surrounded with extremism, a cool aesthetic of indifference took hold through artists such as Duchamp, Cage, Cunningham, Rauschenberg, and Johns. And this attitude was sort of integral to the formation of both pop and continues through minimalism. And then like you can go to Warhol, Rouchet, Judd, Kelly, and so on. And Benjamin Buchloh continues this. This is maybe it's too nerdy, but like sort of furthers the narrative of indifference through administration art, conceptual art, etc. And that sort of art production became playful, ironic, removed, cerebral, and ambiguous through calculated indifference. It rejected progressive institutional models of art, of abstract expressionism. It stopped art from moving towards a pure Greenbergian, sort of, let's say, medium-specific condition. It opened up other possibilities by collecting, mixing things, different mediums, using fragments, incorporating sort of incomplete meaning, perhaps, text, performance, doing things wrong, sort of the bad sketches, the boredom. He talks about boredom so much in this book. It challenges critical institutions of art. And ultimately, Roth's text, I think, is a critique and a lament of Johns, that they could have been more politically engaged, more directly against McCarthy, et cetera, less anti-expressionist, less ambiguous, less cool. And I think given our current climate, especially our current climate perhaps, I think it offers us something to think about. Sort of this aesthetics of indifference for me has returned in America, sort of American architects, younger offices even than us, I think it's much more hardcore. And you can even argue, and even if you argue that, I think it's clear to me, indifference as a model is like at the core of modernism, like Camus, Manet, Cézanne, Léger, etc. It's very much here and now. And we have our own McCarthy political environment. We are kind of operating, I think, explicitly here after a kind of exhaustion of technologically progressive, heroic models of architecture, obsessed with technique and real expression of skills. Even though there's been this kind of expansion of skills through the computer, a kind of progressive model, it sort of has failed. So suggestion is that complexity and contradiction in the lessons are incredibly relevant today. And although I have one critique of the Roth piece, of aesthetics and difference, is that, let's say, the social political agency of artists, of aesthetics, is not by direct engagement. Artistic expression of calculated indifference is not necessarily the avoidance or giving into extremist politics, but when done well, architecture's complexity and contradiction, its calculated ambiguity, its indifference, is a social engine to produce discussion, to produce reflection, to produce thought, to produce action. It's a social engine towards something better. That was my thing, but it sort of explains our position, hopefully, and I think why it's relevant still.
Thank you.
Is that too much? Yeah, sorry.
Sam Jacob. Sam Jacob from London.
That was very interesting, Michael. Because I think it is interesting to think about the kind of the politics. It's a book which is very, I suppose, in some senses, it is a kind of art historical view of architecture, though it does at moments kind of, I guess, hint at this kind of the iceberg below the surface, which is the political, social, economic context. And I think that is interesting. It's also interesting to think, I suppose, of Bob and Denise in 1968. The sort of the great year of a kind of rebellion, and instead of doing that, they head off to Las Vegas, which I think is an interesting kind of thing to imagine where politics exists in architecture. Does it exist in the kind of big gesture of resistance or activism, or those kinds of kind of direct ways of operating, or does it exist, which I think is what Venturi is saying in this book, does it exist within the project itself, i.e. that the whole issue of architecture is really inside architecture, not external, not in, the agency of the architect is only on architecture itself. But to introduce myself, I'm Sam Jacob. I used to run a practice called FAT, which was in London, and I think was incredibly influenced by Bob and Denise. I suppose we were one of the first to declare the love which dare not speak its name, i.e. a kind of second wave interest in postmodernism, coming at it, I think, in exactly the same way Michael was describing it, which is actually we'd never been taught it at school. It never been covered, never been discussed. It was the thing which should never be named. This was a point in British architecture, especially, where I suppose the entire intellectual capacity of British architecture had been completely atrophied. There was modern architecture on one side, and there was Prince Charles on the other, and that was it. And quite frankly, it hasn't really improved that much since then. But we came across postmodernism in a kind of accidental way. We came across it in the Remaindered bookstore. This is the kind of founding myth of FAT. We built a library out of books which nobody else wanted, which were incredibly cheap, and they happened to include a whole stack of books on postmodernism, including big books on the Mother's House, including Learning from Las Vegas, and it was through that I came to Complexity and Contradiction. So I have no idea what its reception was, what its significance was, what ripples it caused on its original publication. But what I can say is that coming across it, not really knowing about it, it struck me as something which was incredibly fresh, which actually spoke to me in a way which all of the stuff around me at the time, architectural culture, such that it was in Britain, didn't. And I suppose this moment was, there was the kind of arguments about history and tradition. On the other hand, there was a kind of end of decon, the beginning of digitalness. And for whatever reason, those things did not seem particularly relevant. Not relevant because I think they didn't resonate with, the problems which seem to be the kinds of things which architecture should be dealing with, which was in the mid-90s. It seemed to be to do with communication. It seemed to be to do with a kind of radical shift in the way in which the world was organised, a kind of rise of electronic communication. It also seemed to be to do with the ways in which things were put together. So you could think perhaps of the rise of sampling culture and how that might be thought of within an architectural context. And those were the kinds of things which really Complexity and Contradiction began to suggest could be possible. Also, that, I mean, it might seem very simple, but it was a total revelation that architecture did not have to provide solutions, that it could be awkward, it could be difficult, it could be redundant, it could be all of the things which I think are exactly what I tried to do when I'm working as an architect, is produce awkwardness and redundancy, and so which is exactly the kind of things which, as a 25-year-old kind of wannabe architect, these are exactly the kinds of things I was looking at in all other forms of culture. The kind of music that I liked, the kind of art that I liked, the kind of TV shows that I liked, were all. And suddenly here was a book which said, actually, legitimately, architecture can also be involved in these kinds of things. It doesn't have to engage with debates with the second in line to the throne. So I think it's also to do, I think, with the range of things. Michael sort of touched on it too, that it flips between pop art, op art, Eliot, Shakespeare, biology, psychology, all sometimes within the same sentence. So it's a book where one sentence will move from talking about the problems of the crappiness of construction, the shittiness of materials, to Gestalt psychology in the same sentence. And it's that kind of open-mindedness, I think, which remains incredibly exciting, incredibly important, because it suggests that architecture is fundamentally connected to a much wider culture, that though, of course, a very disciplinary book, it also argues that that discipline contains already all of these much wider cultural, social, political issues. Thanks.
Thank you. And now Kersten Geers from Brussels.
Okay, thank you. Well, after you two, what is there still to say? I mean, you have kind of... but I mean, look, in a way I find it interesting, and I do want to try to turn this more into a conversation, because I thought that was the thought. I remember from Michael the aesthetic of indifference, which is of course not so strange, because he always talks about the aesthetic of indifference. But now I know where it comes from, right? No, but seriously, it's. I mean, I'm happy to hear that, Michael. And then, I mean, and of course, you Sam, you talk about this awkwardness of things and all other things and everything at the same time. And it's funny because I think in that sense it's good to be here together, because of course both these aspects, and then maybe more Michael's than yours, Sam, is not so much, I think, whatever attracted me or us to the book. And then I do also this kind of midway introduction. I mean, so me, I think I got introduced, I think together with Wanne X, who's here somewhere in the audience, in our school in Brussels, in Ghent, in fact, in Belgium, to complexity immediately without learning from Las Vegas. It was just complexity was right there. And it was no context. So it was just a beautiful book with beautiful pictures and a strange text. So, and I guess the text we only read in parts, and then gradually you start to understand what this most fascinating of expressions, the difficult whole, might mean. And I think so, from my side, it was something of a compagnon de route, something which was always somehow there without exactly understanding what it would mean to me as an architect, and then my practice together with David van Severen. And I often see it a little bit as a kind of a hidden passenger, you know, like somebody who's part of the office, but not many people know, perhaps also David not or something. So which is practical. So you can sometimes open the box and say, oh yeah, you're still there. So for that reason, making this book, and I have it here, of course, this book last year, together with Andrea Zanderigo of Bauco, of Pier Paolo, who's also here, and Jelena Panchevac in our studio in Lausanne. For my side, it was very much almost like showing yourself, like, haha, you know, you might think we make this kind of modernistic, simple, or neoclassicist architecture, but perhaps you have it all wrong, because this is actually what we're looking at. And so, of course, if that's the case, you also have to make this book in a much more concise way, which I hope we did. And I think the argument you have to make also very concise, because I cannot just claim we like everything awkward, because it's absolutely not true. So what do we like, or what's the influence? I guess for us, or for me, it's the first place. I think complexity contradiction is about the practice, which I think is interesting because there's very few books on architecture which are somehow fundamentally about practice. It's about form, 100%, and it has been mentioned. And of course, it's about the difficult whole, which then at first you don't understand, and gradually you start to at least have your own version of what it could be, this difficult whole. And of course, that's also why this book finally got to be called The Difficult Whole, and that's why I think, apart from many other things, I think ultimately the difficult whole here, and what I wanted to mention is that it's in a way the architectural project as a survival strategy, as a kind of self-sustaining idea of context. That's what we've been working on very much when we made the book. There was other themes, but essentially it is about him going to Europe, seeing all kind of things in context, and then thinking that you can reproduce them here in the States where there's absolutely nothing. So the project itself has to survive. So is it in a way an attempt to get to the core of the definition of the project? I mean, what is the project, projectare, stuff like that? Is it the fact that the project has inherently this conflict of many interests and it cannot resolve these? I guess absolutely also. Whatever the case, it is exactly this negotiation with the project, and then almost tautologically, what is the project? Well, the problem of the project is the project. And I feel that it's that, in a way, silly circle thought, which you can even connect, but that's maybe for the next question, to Rossi's thinking of very much the same time, which I felt was our door in. Of course, and afterwards, you simply like the architecture. But it's not because you like the architecture that every awkward corner you have to reproduce.
Thank you, Momoyo Kaijima from Tokyo.
Yes, thank you. I would like to introduce the three intersections from the Venturi's books, because in Japan, first edition happened in the US in 1966, but translation in Japanese, it was happened in 1969. But unfortunately, the first translation were not so good for understanding, I heard, and it is very, very complicated for Japanese architects. So everybody tried to understand, to read the original version from 1966. And but in 1982, the new version coming by a translation from the Kobun Ito, and he is a very important editor and redactor. And for example, our Made in Tokyo book was edited by him, so for example. So and that means I read the book, of course, in Las Vegas, and also Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, myself, and in a study time. But also the many elder architects than me, they are also influenced by these books. And secondary point is intersection is happen. I think I tried to introduce my professor, Kazunari Sakamoto. He didn't mention about a lot of things about the Venturi influenced by himself. But I don't know how many people know his architecture, but he very interested in about the icon or image of the architecture in Japanese urban society or urban situation. For example, he tried to find out the form of the house in an urban context, because the suburban area after World War II in Japan, around Tokyo, every house are not so related to the traditional Japanese house. It was made by many house maker or new developments. That form were not related to the history or related to our society itself. That's why my professor started to thinking about what is the form of house, or what is the form of the architecture in that period, from 1960 to the 90 up to today. And he tried to focusing on the form or edge of the, for example, roof, form of the roof, or form of the window, or form of the lot of element of the ordinary things in his practice. So we are very big influenced by his practice. Atelier was very interested in about the designing of the windows, or roof, or floor, or context. Yeah, because these ordinary elements are related to the many different level in among the urbanscape or landscape or tradition or today's kind of struggling the urbanscape in the suburban Tokyo, for example. So we are looking for the similarity or also the difference from the existing the condition, and try to find out what is good or what is better or a good way of the method of the design, the new phase of the our form itself. And third intersection is we met, fortunately, so we met Venturi in Japan. That was he visited in Japan to about the publication party or lecture in Tokyo, I think almost 2000, something like. And also my partner Yoshiharu visited the mother's house with Venturi on 2007. And he showed me the many photographs about the how window, very beautiful inside. And it's also very good timing to realize for me to understand how the library window the Venturi did. And also that third one good interesting event we participate, the Leap House changing of the address, the 2009 by a storefront gallery event, and we attended the very early morning, the pier in New York, and it was also very interesting moment for changing the address, the existing of the house, where to go somewhere to the suburban area. So that is also very memorial good things for me. So I think our influence are not directly, more kind of, how can I say, influence from the kind of some different influenced us. so to study in the today's. So I think the contradiction and these books are very serious, so important meaning for us to think about the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And now James Timberlake in Philadelphia again.
Thank you, David. Going last, I'm sure I'm going to have some random thoughts on top of random thoughts here, but I'll try and organize them. You know, the question was, how has this book affected your own practice, and how might it have affected the practice of others? I think one of the first things I would say is that this was a book that I initially picked up in the fall of 1974 after a colleague in my design class at UPenn collared me about 8 weeks into a design session there and said, have you read this book? And I said, no. And he said, well, what books have you read? And I talked about some of the books that I'd read at the time, and he said, well, this is the most important book that you'll read. And I immediately went out and got that book and read it again. And that book is sitting here. And it's probably been read at least once a decade over the last, since leaving school. So it's affected me, but also I think Steve and me, to pile on what he said, at 3 levels: at school, then in working at Bob and Denise's and John's office in Philadelphia, and then in our own approach. And I'd like to just touch briefly on each of those. First, in school, I think one of the things that it did was it made, for me, not with an art history background and an architectural history background, but an architecture background, it made sense of history and theory for me. And I think it's probably profoundly, as you've heard, here, everybody has a slightly different interpretation, I think, probably of the book and what it means. But, a lot of the other art history and architectural history books were kind of dry, and they were explaining buildings, but it didn't really explain how we got to those buildings. Bob, in this book, explains how he's getting to these buildings. Second of all, and Michael touched on this, I think, was the inclusion of art, that it wasn't just this sort of, dry treatise on analyzing architecture and its composition, but a broader inclusion of other factors that made up architecture. Really the first introduction, I think, to me, and it's a term that Steve and I use frequently, a kind of holistic approach to design and architecture, and comes from that architecture of inclusion. Lastly, in school, I think it was a permission. It was permission to reject orthodoxy. Coming through undergraduate architecture school in the Midwest and then coming out to Penn, there was an awful lot of orthodoxy. You will do it this way, and there was a lot of things that I think for many young architects who were just trying to learn a process and trying to learn how to design, that orthodoxy was overwhelming. How could we possibly, do Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe or even Frank Lloyd Wright or anybody else, because this is such a personal art and science. So it was that permission to kind of reject orthodoxy and think about it in different ways. Moving on to working for Bob and Denise, it opened up a couple of other things. One, reflecting on the book now that I was working at the office, there was this deep humanism throughout the book, a kind of having an appreciation of the person in architecture, being affected by these artifacts, and how design was very much part of that. Secondly, craft, making architecture of a difficult whole was very much, an aspect of craft, and Bob was very much, that was very much a piece of what he worked very hard at, as did Denise, each and every day. And then it was the difficult whole. And I think the thing that people, I've run into people who have graduated from Cornell, good friends of mine, who kind of simplistically kind of, poo-pooed the book, when we were in Rome. But, in this particular case, I think the difficult whole is really heavily edited and refined. And the working of that craft and trying to make architecture in the Venturi Scott Brown firm was, it was hard. It was really hard, and you get these sort of simple outcomes, perhaps, but the process of getting there was one of deep anxiety and angst working the work. And so, the book clearly is a justification, I think, of practice, including history and theory for Bob, and in that way, a kind of justification of the work, certainly at this early age, trying to introduce himself into a world that was dominated by, several large names at the time. I think the other thing folks should remember about school, and then the late 70s going into the early 80s, is particularly in school. Postmodernism wasn't a term that was being discussed in 1974 to 1977. It came after all of that, and this, so this is 11 years, or more into this book. And when Steve and I got to Bob and Denise's office, Bob would constantly rail against, not being a modern, he was a modernist. He was, the whole conversation about being postmodern was sort of like an anathema. Lastly, just briefly about the practice, and Steve touched on this, but I just want to add, or reinforce a couple things. One was research, and I think, this was a research firm. Venturi, Rock, and Scott Brown. It was everything was deeply kind of analyzed and not superficially sort of picked out of a book, but really grindingly, deeply understood, and nothing superficial about what was being worked on, without a kind of an ability to discuss it in a deep and meaningful way. And that research was something that was imparted to us, I think. Obviously, we take it in different ways, along with the process. But I think lastly, where we began having to start our practice in Philadelphia was really having to say, their work is their work, and that from here on, our work has to be some other, direction. And there's bits and pieces of it that clearly, as I think Sam or Kersten also mentioned, is with you all the time. The book is with you all the time, and you can't really get away from it once you've read this book, I think. Clearly the direction that we've tried to take is partly in reaction to some of the things that obviously Bob and Denise, were doing or not doing, coming out of that. Thanks, David.
Thank you. And a very interesting comment about the fact that different people have different impressions of the book. And with that in mind, and I think, by the way, that's a criterion of a good book, is that it does ask for different impressions. I wonder if you could question each other or comment on each other's impressions. Plus or minus, are there objections? What do you support? Well, the difficult whole and the fact that what can appear simple is not easy to achieve.
No, but well, of course, I mostly speak for my contemporaries, of course, because we know each other. It's not, we know each other for a long time. No, I think the difficult whole or complexity is a place where we intersect, even though our practices do not necessarily make the same architecture. And I find that quite interesting. So that is indeed, and it's been mentioned, there's an aspect of there's a kind of openness about the book in a certain way. Let's say, and even though, and I know Pierre is going to talk about that tomorrow in one of the papers he does, it's contemporary, the architecture of the city of Rossi is also somehow multi-interpretable, but somehow harder, a little bit at least. I think the combination of pictures and text already suggests that you can look at the pictures and not at the text, or you can see the difficult whole, the last chapter, as the main chapter, or you can pretend it's rather an afterthought. There's plenty of thoughts about this book which are allowed somehow. And at the same time, of course, I guess, and that's not the topic of tonight, but since they made a few years later this other book, Learning from Las Vegas, you can either choose to like one book and not the other, and vice versa, which I think is also quite interesting. So I think there's not so many architectural practices who manage to make two relevant books in their lifetime. Normally you make one and then you have nothing to say anymore. So in that sense I find it interesting. So you can easily say, I dismiss Learning from Las Vegas, I don't like it because it kind of confuses the argument, which is often what I would like to say. And then, of course, you say that with amazing respect for that second book as well. But I mean, it's just that you can choose. And I find that quite particular. So then when Sam explains his practice or his former practice, from the visual hallucinations of the work, I understand that. But of course, it's not the full story. I mean, I have the impression that you can look at it that way, and you can draw bubbles next to every of your project, like you did for a while, right? But then again, I mean, I think it's a little bit deeper than that, or isn't it?
Well, it's also funny because if you look at this book, you can look at it in another way too, which is it's got two books in it. One is the justification for a set of projects. Like here's the thinking, and this is what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'd rather cut that book out of this. I'd cut this book in half.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more interesting when it's more suggestive, when it's less complete, when it's more.
You mean when
his
own projects are not in?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would say that at that point it sort of it switches modes and becomes something which I think is.
I have to. Yeah. Are we just doing? We're freestyling here.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're freestyle.
I have to say I love the projects. So I'll just take a counterpoint. For me, it's not even so much the projects are great. I think, but even if you read the descriptions of the projects,
Yeah,
like let's say the description of the YMCA project for me is just mind-blowingly weird and interesting. He talks to just over and over again. He's sort of like, this is what I mean by the indifference thing. It becomes clear to me when he says how boring it is, or how ugly it is, or it's just like it's just like the factory, and because it goes on forever. It's just repetitive without end. He'll just describe it in a way that is so bizarre in the context in which we are trained or come out of our context. And I just, it's true. I just want to follow up on something that you said, Kirsten, is that we all know each other to some degree, better and worse. And I would say you're all architects I really admire, which, for whatever that is worth. And no buts. And I think there's a moment, and I'd say we are, plus or minus things, but we're a kind of generational kind of thing. I would say we come out of a moment that is also like, let's say, the book, after a very heroic moment in the field, where it feels like, you were saying, completely full. Like you were describing, I think this, like the moments come out, it feels full, everything is occupied, Rudolph's running the world or whatever. I have no idea what this context is exactly. But like, and you're, sort of you're working for a kind of master architect. You have to start your own thing. You have to figure it out. And you start from the world at large. You're starting with this kind of very deadpan view. You're finding these remainder items and trying to build something out of it. You're looking at maybe forgotten histories or something, where there's a kind of moment after very, at one level, an incredibly important moment in the field, where it was a kind of technological expansion at unheard of levels, like new technologies, both in how we draw, how we communicate, how we model, how we calculate architecture, and then somehow going somewhere else, like not following. That's where everyone was going.
No, but I agree with you. Yeah. But it's even true for me that, I mean, the architects just before us, or maybe 2 generations before us, I mean, of course, not all of them, because you always oversimplify, but there was a very big interest in content, in some sense. I mean, a discourse driven by content. And, I mean, one of the quotes I think we use in the very end of this book was, which comes from complexity, was at a certain point towards the end of the chapter Difficult Whole, there's this topic, unfinished content, finished form, and then a valid split between form and content. And I feel it's there where you reconnect. And I think it's also very much this book, and I think that's where there's a parallel between at least our generation, all of us, maybe with different goals in mind. But this kind of shameless embrace of formalism up to a point, and being aware of the fact that it's a slightly slippery path and that you just don't show whatever, but that you can talk about it. That, of course, if you start to talk about ancestors, I mean, well, then you talk about form for a big part. And then again, and I mean, let's say our friends at San Rocco, I would like to say, and of course it's not just San Rocco, but I mean, all of us there, we just look at these things with the naive eyes of a child, right? You like something because it has a beautiful plan.
Just a few thoughts on the relationship between buildings and manifestos. As an architect, if you write a manifesto, there's almost, not almost, there is an obligation to then try and build the manifesto. If there's no building, then there's no belief, it's just theory. And that's an agenda. The manifesto was written in 1996. I think you spend a career trying to figure out how to build it then. And one way to look at the work is that. It was trying to build the argument in the book. And let me offer one observation from the inside about building that manifesto. And James probably has others from the inside, but to me, when I reflect on the whole arc of the work, the high point in it was with Wu Hall at Princeton, a building maybe some of you are familiar with, many not, but it was built in the early 1980s, and it fully and deeply and reflects the entire argument of refabricating architecture, that's hard, I wish, of complexity and contradiction. What's that book? But it reflects it, it reflects it entirely, really, in one building, very wholly and very completely and very maturely. And I worked on it a little bit at the outset and came back on the end of it, and then subsequently wrote about it when I went to teach at Princeton, and had a lot of opportunity to reflect on what was accomplished in that book. And the interesting thing that came out of it for me personally as a practicing architect, by that point we were just starting to begin our own practice in 1984, was the question of, okay, what does this building as a representation of that book tell me how to go forward as a young architect trying to make my way in the world, make our way in the world? And the answer on the building side was discomforting, but on the manifesto, on the book side, remains resonant. And it was discomforting on the building side because to this day I look at it as brilliant, as a brilliant building, Wu Hall, but a very rhetorical building. It's about a conversation within conversations within conversations of one history commenting on and undermining another. And it is absolutely brilliant in the way that reading a text by T.S. Eliot is brilliant. It just goes on and on and on with layer after layer. You've got a representation of a keystone in a wall over a top of a Corbusian curtain wall with an expansion joint running through the keystone. And it's comment after comment after comment, undercutting, one irony layered upon another. And as an architect trying to say, okay, how do I go forward from this? At some point, there's so much irony and undercutting that there's no clear path forward for somebody trying to figure out what to do next. And that was, I think, a point James and I very much found ourselves in reflecting on it. And that in no way undermines the book, because the book is a manifesto and it is abstract, it's general. You can take huge numbers of, huge lessons out of that book today, just as you could 50 years ago, that are resonant depending on the framework you have. But what you can't take out of it as a way forward, I think, are the buildings. Those are particular.
Right. I just to add on to that for a moment, sort of tie together something, Michael, you said, I think, about the kind of wit in the in the descriptions. The layer upon layer upon layer that is in Wu Hall is this book, no question, and it's an incredibly difficult whole to understand in one sitting, in many sittings, and I can't tell you, I think I take something out of it each and every time that I read it. But I also think that that gets to why the work is perhaps misunderstood. It's why the book sometimes is misinterpreted for what it was supposed to be. You know, and the kind of wit or the intentional trying to take the edge off the seriousness of making architecture, both for his work, their work, but also, you know, working that wit and charm into and the joy into the architecture that they strived to make, I think is also misunderstood in the context of the orthodoxy of teaching and architectural history, you know, and the kind of arc of looking at their work. It's like, you know, this outlier of, you know, kind of bizarreness to some people, you know, because they just don't understand the irony and the layer upon layer upon layer upon edit upon refinement that allows that stuff to reside as the art that it is. And it, you know, I mean, I can't tell you how many arguments I think I've been in over the last 40 some odd years since leaving architecture school about not only this book, but also their work, having worked there, you know, and you know, having a different understanding of it for that reason, because it's completely, you know, for some, it's misunderstood.
But maybe there's also a question of, like, what point does it become? At what point is the work an illustration of the manifesto? And I think at a certain point, also, how long can it stay open, or at least have cracks in it which allows things into it? And at what point does it become an entirely sealed world? I mean, I remember going to visit Bob and Denise and being just as amazed as Michael was about boringness, as Bob would take us around the office saying this is a very boring project. And we're like, oh well, he's probably going to explain the next one and it's going to be really interesting. But this one's even more boring. And as he got further and further on, he got more and more excited about how dull they were, which was like insanely amazing, like, and shocking to you know, it's brought up in an age where architecture was supposed to be kind of spectacular, exciting, like every time completely original, never seen it before, always reinventing something. To have someone who was so delighted by the fact they could be banal, I think is incredible. But it's also very strange because it sort of, I don't know, kind of in a way recedes into itself. At a certain point, it feels that some of that kind of optimism, which I feel in this book, or even the kind of psychedelia almost, which is then learning from Las Vegas, kind of vanishes. And so something else comes in, which I think is maybe misunderstandings and the problems that come from misunderstandings. So I'd say maybe it's interesting to think about the dialogue between the architect as writer, the architect as architect, the architect as or, you know, all of these kinds of things, and the relationship between them. That the text does not necessarily precede the building, and the building is not the result of. That they're actually always in text.
Like the buildings are always ambiguous. I mean, especially this text, like we were saying. So I think it's different if you write a manifesto and you're like.
Well, yeah, exactly. I was wondering, manifesto, it's so easily used. It's true, it's introduced like that, gentle manifesto. But at most a gentle manifesto, but perhaps a manifesto that wasn't, or something. I've never really quite understood it as a manifesto, and I guess its success is that it's not, like, as a matter of fact.
Why do you not see it as a manifesto?
Yeah, for the simple reason that it's extremely unclear to figure out what they're saying to you.
It's impossible. You have to, you can't decipher it all. It's, I think, though, that's the beauty of it in a way. Yeah, I was trying to think of the boredom thing. I'm trying to figure out what Sam. I'm trying to respond to this a little bit, if it as a problem, because it seems like you're presenting it as a problem. This boredom and the irony is potentially the self-consciousness of it is insulating or something. Is that what the?
I guess so. I mean, yeah, I think, or maybe.
So is Woody Allen. So are Woody Allen films. So the same kind of.
But by the way, when he's talking about Venturi, I think he's talking about Fat and himself a little bit. But so I'm just trying to.
Well, but, so when we had this little show
we're doing
at
some therapy
Penn,
here.
and Bob came to see it, and he was very kind, and he was like looking at us, and we was like, oh my God, look, Bob Venturi's here. And he said he looked at our work and he said it's not boring, but in a good way. And that's kind of amazing kind of Venturian aphorism where you have to kind of think about it for 5 minutes before you're not sure whether you've been insulted or quite how you have been insulted, or whether being insulted is a good thing. I mean, I'd say it's also to do with maybe their own personal history and the way they were received and the way they were treated by many other people. The stories in London are terrible about the National Gallery extension and the kind of ways they got caught in the crossfire of other things, and totally misreading any nuance whatsoever, which must have been entirely appalling for people of great intelligence and great subtlety. But I think that maybe is the difficulty. Maybe the reception of the work made it, somehow made them somehow insulated from the world, insulate themselves from the world. So in some ways, the rhetoricalness becomes a kind of echo chamber in a sense. And I think at the early point, say up to to the mid 70s, there's still this kind of possibility that it could be part of the world, that it is still honky tonk, that it's not only.
But the counterpoint for me is, of course, we're all here talking about it, and so the echo chamber, let's say, is not insulated. I mean, it continues, and we're still trying to figure it out. So that the kind of complexity and the ambiguity that's produced, that is the social project. That is a utopian project, perhaps even, and a formal project.
I mean, that remains, to me, the core value of the book, is just that in a world where everybody seems to want to define things as this or that, black or white, it's kind of a very rich celebration of gray, a million shades of gray. And if I take out of it anything as a manifesto, it's that's the world you should inhabit. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's not this, it's not that. It's
true.
Judgments that you have to make every day, thousands of them, and they're really complicated, they're not easy, and anybody who comes along with a manifesto that says this is easy, this is what you should do, this is the answer, is fundamentally wrong. So in that regard, you could consider it an anti-manifesto that becomes a manifesto by being an anti-manifesto of sorts, so to speak. But that's what I think will resonate forever.
No, but I agree. But I'm always fascinated by this. If everything is both and everything is grey and shades of grey, as you said it, it becomes extremely difficult to judge something good from bad, in the sense that they were extremely talented themselves to make a good project.
It's always difficult.
No, I know, but of course, and everybody expects a recipe. They did not give a recipe. Thank God they didn't give a recipe. Yeah. But of course, that when they decided not to give a recipe, and then they show, and that's where I agree with Michael. I like very much the project in the end of the book, because they tell you all kind of things, and then they show a bunch of very good projects. So apparently it's possible to make good projects with that. So you're kind of, I don't know, comforted in some sense. And my disappointment also, I mean, I think at least the three of us here share that a bit. At a certain point, and I do consider Gordon Wu a very beautiful building, but at a certain point, quite right after that, well, it happens from time to time, but somehow the project doesn't have that intensity. Maybe you just get old and it's impossible. We'll face that fact at a certain point, I guess.
I mean, not
necessarily.
Oh, sorry.
It's supposed to be a celebration.
No, but okay, come on. I mean,
no, I know what you mean. I hear you. I hear you. I don't know where to go from there, though. But
what's next?
James knows where to go from
I think David knows where to go.
I'm really not sure, but I must say you've talked about relevance, and before we open it to the audience, I'd like to read something that I think represents the kind of orthodoxy that perhaps Venturi would have objected to today, and this was from a recent editorial in Architectural Record. I read it not because I like it, but because it was there. The world's most urgent problems confronting architects today is poverty, mass migration, environmental degradation, housing, and social inequities of every sort. These are pressing issues. Are they truly the most relevant issues today? And if so, how does Bob's book help us address them?
Well, that wasn't the second question, but
That's a good question.
but I'll try and riff on that for a little bit.
Add to it because
Yeah.
of the comments.
You know, to get to that and just to kind of bridge, you know, I think a little bit of what we're saying here is I really truly believe that this is a living book. This is not a book that, you know, is now, you know, of a time and put away. This is a book that will resonate 100 years from now because people will continue to take a different set of meanings out of it. I just want to read a couple things here as part of the answer to that question. This is from the second introduction by Vincent Scully, and it's his opening couple of lines. This is not an easy book. It requires professional commitment and close visual attention, and it is not for those architects who, lest they offend them, pluck out their eyes. You know, so it's, and he goes on to say that it unfolds like a curtain slowly lifting from the eyes, piece by piece, in close focus after focus, the whole emerges. Arthur Drexler, ahead of that, says, quote, the ambiguous and sometimes unattractive facts, quote unquote, in which architects find themselves enmeshed at each moment, and whose confusing nature Venturi would seek to make the basis of architectural design. You know, that goes back to that comment that I mentioned about permission, you know, that it opened up, I think, a realm for all of us to explore the realms of architecture and art and the combination of those and science in a way that just was not being taught to us in architecture school or through practice. And I think that that's why this book will continue to be relevant in current and future discourse. What people took out of it at the time was like some things that people have taken out of books that Steve and I have written, you know, something at that time, which isn't necessarily the core meaning of that book at that particular point, but that's how they've come to understand it in their first reading, and that's perfectly legitimate. But that's why a book like this is read over and over and over and over again. I think the second piece, to get to David's, you know, more complex question, is that, you know, in terms of it, how it's relevant currently and in the future is, and I think we see this, a very uneven appreciation or understanding of architectural history and theory at this moment in time by a series of generations that are coming up underneath us, being mentored by us, you know, tutelaged, you know, if you will, you know, and working with us and collaborating with us. And I think one of the things that this book always has done for me, at least, and I think for some others, is put theory and history in a context that you know, asks you to question how that history and that theory can be appreciated and understood. And I think with contemporary architecture from 1985 on, particularly the last, you know, decade and a half, you know, this is a wonderful way to kind of try to go back to some of, you know, the modern icons, current modern icons of architecture, and really try to have an appreciation of how to decant them and dissect them in a way. And then very lastly, very quickly, it's I think just appreciating the nuance of architecture and the act of editing. You know, that too often I think the orthodoxy is, you know, and it has been for a long time, that it's a singular idea by a singular person at a singular moment, you know, the historic napkin sketch on a plane, you know, that then is, you know, imparted and attempted to be built. And it's only gotten worse, I think, in this digital age of a lack of appreciation of paper space and digital space and scale and the humanism that can come out of nuance and editing. And I think that's ultimately, you know, if I was going to ask somebody to go get schooled, you know, you know, who was really just not producing something of you know, of texture and craft and deep depth, you know, this is the book, you know, I'd ask them to go read first.
Good answer. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, one thing for me, I would just like to sort of riff off of that a little bit is, I don't know if this book will be relevant in 100 years. I don't know if it was relevant maybe even 15, 20 years ago in the same way that I think it's relevant now. I think it will be assigned reading, which might kill it even. It is assigned reading. So, but I think part of it's, you know, we don't, for me, I think there's, at this very moment that we're in architecture, there is a moment where there's a renewed interest in history, again, even if it's very superficial, let's say, it's there. So, and this book is kind of useful in that regard. There is, in a way, a kind of, I think the tone of it, one thing to say is that everybody here writes, and I think even the writing techniques and way of writing is very similar. I mean, in a way that we were, like I said at the beginning, we were definitely not taught to write like that. I mean, it was a kind of act to sort of use the first person even. It was, for me, you know, it was like you were supposed to be more objective, and the objectivity of the field of architecture through techniques and through a kind of, let's say, 90s methodologies driven, or at least from my education, kind of project has hit a wall. And in that way, this book opens up possibilities again for younger, like I think for offices after us that are now in American offices, young American offices that seem much more picking up complexity and contradiction almost in a much more urgent way.
One or two brief comments before we open it up to the audience.
I'm sorry, I wanted to give a direct answer to your question, actually. Yeah. Architecture record, comment, what would Venturi say, right? I mean, I was looking up because I remember something in his introduction. I think, quite frankly, the Venturi of '66, my opinion, would have not cared at all. And just to prove this, so he would write in the introduction, I make no special attempt to relate architecture to other things. I have not tried to improve the connections between science and technology on the one hand, and humanities and the social sciences on the other, and make of architecture a more human social art. I try to talk about architecture rather than around it. And I think that's great, you know, who cares?
I mean, just to close on it, I have a contrary opinion about the value of this book as a manifesto that addresses the real and pressing problems that David articulated. Those historically have been treated by architects as simple problems. And I've got a simple, holistic solution to it. I'm going to level it, or you know, and I'm going to find a way to idealize it. And I think inherent in the book is an appreciation about the complexity of the whole, that architects and planners and designers of the physical world would always be well served by remembering. We take our graduate students, it took them for several years to Dhaka, precisely because when they walked into that place, they understood that they didn't have any capacity to help these people that was going to be relevant and useful to the enormous complexity of the relationships of the problems they face daily between water, between shelter, between clean drinking water, between food, and they become much more capable observers and much more humble servants, if you will, by addressing, with humility, a circumstance like that and becoming a great observer of it for a long time before they ever propose any solutions. And that seems to me to be, an underlying message of the book in a way.
I wonder, Momoyo, if you would like to make a comment at this point before we turn it over to the audience.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, and I'm hearing from the discussion about also maybe so in Japan we had also a lot of good books from the postmodernisms. For example, the 1964 is Architecture Without Architects, and also the 1960s many American architects, or originally they grown up in Europe to move to America to study or work in America, and they started to also make a lot of books. And for me, to why they are thinking about, they started to write something in that moment, and I'm also thinking about maybe in the US has a lot of interesting experiment at the moment to how to looking for the form or a building type of architecture in that society, because past period of exchangeable situation or moving people so far, city and city, and also the new suburban area happened in also in Japan happened, but here in the US has a lot of suburban area, and urban planning, and a lot of things happen in here, and but then for me, the Venturi Las Vegas, learning from Las Vegas and complexity and contradiction in architecture is I found a very similar intention. The one is more focusing on the why Venturi thought maybe from where he come from, something like as American, and also for example Las Vegas, he tried to find as a new influence or phenomena in the urban context in America, and he tried to explain why it happened or how to read. I think his intention to finding the way to the form itself, how represented the background or history or context of several meaning in as a difficult to hold, and it's not so easy to explain only one word because of his layering, and then for example in Japanese case, why we are very also interested in Venturi case, because in Japan after World War II we lost some sort of the traditional background, and we imported many new culture or from US or from abroad, and we are very we are worried about where we go to where to go, so something like, and then Venturi showed us a very good way to understand how we can do. So he say easily, so okay, let's learn from life, or in the life. So the life could be also explain what we can do or what we try to do. And that's why in the life is always a very complex and very contradiction. So, for example, in Japan, so after World War II, everybody wear the kimono, but also we started to wear the European clothes. So in one day, for example. So very, very so contradictional so way of the life. So that I think, but it's also very good for keeping this kind of differentiation in diversity in the life, because we can keep interesting diversity all the time. So yeah, I don't know exactly. Maybe if of course you are already discussing about why Venturi started to write these books as American. But I don't know, so if you have some ideas, so please let me know.
Well, it's a difficult question, but if I answer it, we won't have a chance for the audience to ask their questions. And I think since we need to try to wind up by 8:30, that if there are audience questions, could we have them now? There's a hand back there. Now, is someone traveling with a mic? Good. There are two questions, one here and one here.
So as somebody who took Bob's course, ate in Grant's restaurant, and reviewed the book in '68. When I got to New York, I was struck at how orthodox the discipline was. Architectural Record would not publish any of Venturi's buildings, would not review the book. PA, because C. Ray Smith was the interiors editor, he championed Venturi, but no one else would publish it. I saw people almost burst a blood vessel if I would bring up Venturi at an Architectural League meeting. So I'm wondering, when you people, in dealing with your contemporaries, did you find an orthodox resistance?
Okay. Orthodox resistance? We had some mention of that, I believe.
I think in the last years this has changed a lot. 5 years ago, perhaps. Now, almost not anymore. Yeah. I mean, it's my experience. No?
Well, I guess it's also almost the collapse of the mechanisms of criticism and the kind of the way in which an orthodoxy can be controlled. There's so few critics actually left, and those that are don't really have the same kind of power. The way that architecture is communicated is entirely different. In fact, that's probably got a lot to do with the fact that many of us are almost as interested in writing and publishing and communicating through other forms of media as we are in building, or we certainly feel that they're very much part of the sort of project of architecture. And in that sense, it's much more difficult to offend anybody, I think, which is maybe not a good thing.
My response to your question would be: is there really aren't any orthodoxies left? I mean, there's just a lot of orthodoxies, perhaps, which would mean there's none. So it's the media environment has radically changed. Publishing has radically changed. The idea that there are a few people who are the gatekeepers of a conversation is no longer the case. Anybody can put their stuff out there and have comments or likes or whatever you want, and in the entire world, the media world has diffused. So even it's impossible. I mean, by the way, we have all written a lot. You have never read it. Like in a sense that there's just so much nowadays. Like, it's impossible to even have something that would reverberate in the same way.
Yeah, that's a big problem, because since there's no orthodoxies, you can also not take a real position. So, in a way, it's impossible to acquire a position as this book acquired, in a certain sense. Yeah.
Well, just taking it back, though, to the late 1960s, there were orthodoxies in the 1960s, and there was an agenda to work against the orthodoxies, not just in architectural terms, but across society at that particular moment in history. And frankly, I think there was a reveling in being the rebel against the orthodoxy that was, on some levels, actually relished. And it
here
was
we are.
part of the fame. I mean, we're here today in part because it was against an orthodoxy. It became famous in part because it was contrarian. And yes, many didn't agree, but
it's still sanctioned by MoMA. I mean, we are
yeah,
at
I mean,
MoMA. I mean, what is orthodoxy then? I mean, like so I think it was orthodoxy replacing orthodoxy perhaps or something, but even now we don't even have that. Like, not as a lament. I think it's awesome, by the way. It got amazing potential. I think, I don't know where it goes, but I think it's full of possibilities.
But I think, part of the project is almost to try to construct like kind of phantom orthodoxies, like his Kersten's book, which looks like super beautiful. It's like a kind of almost like a caricature of a really amazing book. And in some senses,
it's the opposite of, in a way, the Complexity and Contradiction in terms of its materiality. And
glittery,
beautiful.
Gold embossed lettering
Otherwise people
on the
don't
front.
find the book.
But so in some senses, it's like how I guess one part of the problem now is how do you establish a position, but also something which resembles a position, perhaps more than a real position, and like making something an object like that is part of the kind of the act of maybe trying to even make an orthodoxy.
Good point, and I think maybe there was another question.
So I think I have the mic here. I'm a because it helps to see. I'm a young practicing architect who spent a fair amount of time in Philadelphia. So my question, though, I think what you're all talking about, and what I'm curious about, is in this still being relevant, and why I'm here and interested in it as a young thinker who has many interests in art, architecture, and civics, is the question of production and delivery, project delivery, in a number of different senses. Of how we begin to, in 2016, I think, receive or give forth this information or whatever information it is. I mean, talking about succession, and I'll quickly finish up, but generations in architecture aren't familial. They're not the same duration. So I'm curious about that concept as you all have maybe presented it. And finally, I'm not sure if Bill is here tonight, but perhaps on Saturday, you all will maybe, I haven't seen the exhibit yet, but have a chance to see Bob Venturi's thesis boards, which is something that you develop a set of thinking out of producing a body of work. And I think maintaining a position through that is what grounds you in doing it. So I wonder about the institutional context that produces.
So your question is the institutional complex?
My question is about delivery.
Okay, delivery. Any response? It's a vague question.
Yeah.
I don't understand.
I don't think we can understand. Let's go to another question.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention that really hasn't, I think, come up, I mean, Venturi was fighting against an orthodoxy maybe of the establishment and Harvard School and Rudolph, but at the same time, I keep thinking of Colin Rowe and his articles, and then the controversy that subsequently develops between the white and the gray architects, and I don't know if that's really relevant here, but I'd be curious to know, how you responded to some of the other challenges.
Hold the mic.
Orthodox modernism, sorry.
Yes, a very interesting point about the whites and the grays, and I remember Bob Stern's article on Stoppin' at the Savoy.
But I'm going to kind of respond, but in a kind of annoying way, I think, because I'm going to say that maybe that was the problem of that era, which was positions were were easily staked out, and that in some senses that ate up all of the kind of energy was internal rather than I think kind of directed outward as a kind of project in the world. And maybe we don't have the possibility for that now. We don't really have the possibility to take positions, so we don't have the possibility to have whites and greys because nobody cares anymore, apart from perhaps Patrick Schumacher. But
that's not true.
That's not completely true.
Come on, man, that's so sad. That's too sad.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, that's too sad. I think, like,
well,
the one thing I would say,
where do you think
I would
those
tie those two. I
things
want to tie
exist,
the question that we never got to this last one. And I think, for me, the whites and the grays, let's say, I think it's pretty clear with at least this rowdy group up here that there's no difference. I think the grays and the whites, the great about gray is it can absorb white, I guess, to some degree. And the whites have become absorbed into the grays. So I think it's very easy to go from a New York 5 model with Venturi as well, and it gets all mixed up. And I think that happens already in the work. I think at the same time, the thing about positions and generations, I just think that the thing that's striking to me, and this is more of how, let's say, orthodoxy works or institutions, is that how global it all has become. Like that we can all here talk about Colin Rowe or whatever and know what you're talking about. And we are all from different places. And this is strange to me. Like there is no, and we may be at the end of this globalization, it seems like, when we talk about politics. But like these models are, it is like, it has been an incredible expansion of conversations, and that has also diluted perhaps the problem of orthodox. I mean, we're using that as a stand-in, but let's say orthodoxy or sort of institutional or authority kind of figures. I think what's happened in lieu of it is that we have the need to produce new provincialities, even within ourselves, even kind of small enthusiasms. That's what I'm saying. When I was trying to say how much I do admire you, it's not only that I'm saying that as like a kind of, you know, we're here and I'm trying to be polite or whatever. It's just that you are part of a world because of the way that the media has constructed, let's say, and even that I have to construct for generations, a world of other architects that I know what they're doing, and I am thinking about responding to it in a way. And as with other people, and it's in your own work, and I think that's what you do as an architect. You can't do everything. There's a few architects that you have to pick and choose, and you think about it, and you think about their work, and you are kind of, or are, you know, like how obsessed was he with Kahn? Obviously, you know, you look at all the work, even in here, it's clear he's thinking like, you know, or maybe Rudolph as well, like, but really Kahn, like coming out of this thing, this kind of heavy influence. And then trying to have fun with it, trying to play with it, trying to push it in another direction, trying to do things wrong, trying to be boring as opposed to heroic and, you know, spiritual, etc. So you do, that's what we all do. Mm-hmm. You have to do that too, wherever you are. And I'm all for provinciality, so just like pick a couple people.
Sure. I think I should not give another long answer, but.
Sorry.
If I understood the white and the grey as if it still is there today, that's how I think Michael and me we reacted. I think it's there very much today. Maybe you use other media, but I mean, at least in terms of performance of architecture, or say, to what extent you allow a certain abundance of form. I mean, there's absolutely camps also today. These camps are there. I mean, and they're not so different from the ones which were there like 30, 40 years ago. But that's maybe a whole other debate. It is absolutely true that if you then talk to us, it's probably true that we can as much like a project of a New York 5 architect than one who used to be his adversary. But that has simply to do with how time changes your perception towards these episodes. No, I mean, you look at books and you don't always immediately understand that they were opposing fractions, and that's also good. No, I mean, that's also why if I speak for at least some of us here, I think it's very interesting to look at work without knowing much of the the background of how it came about and how they actually designed it and what they were thinking about and who made the actual drawing in the office. It frees you and you can judge the work from your perspective. And I think if, as our generation, we would like to make that work active again, we have to allow ourselves that freedom, so we do not have to figure out what exactly happened. We have to be a little bit naive.
Another question from the audience? There's a hand back there.
Hi. Being honest, I'm quite surprised that in a certain way, because we miss, in my opinion, a crucial point that is how radical Venturi was in the selection of the architecture that he put on the book. Because the first part basically is, I am from Rome, so I understood how he was deeply connected with Rome, and he chose the Porta Pia for the cover of the book, and basically he was really strong politically, and really, he selected, no, but wait, you understand my position step by step, because he spent in Rome a crucial part of his study course, okay? And basically he selected a group of architects that were completely removed from the establishment of our academy. Luigi Moretti were completely deleted because he was part of the fascist architecture. Armando Brasini was completely deleted. At the same time, in the Renaissance, he took Peruzzi, that was completely underestimated in our scenario. And basically, how can we say that it's a manifesto, it's a gentle manifesto, it's not a manifesto? Was completely a manifesto, maybe stronger than Le Corbusier manifesto, because it was a postmodern manifesto that basically he tried, in my opinion, to restart in a certain way to study architecture, to understand history in architecture. And basically, for us, this is the crucial part.
And your question?
And the question is how we can today in a certain way follow the legacy that Venturi started, and we miss for 20 years after the Deacon Show of 8080 this legacy in study architecture, and understand which is the position of an architect following his study.
I think we've talked about the legacy and how it might be taken or moved forward. Are there any further comments or responses to that question?
How is connected with the course that an architect follow in his university career?
Well, just a brief response. Having also, Steve and I both, at different times lived in Rome, and so, obviously, this is a book that on my first grand tour, I took around Europe and annotated, and not all the projects are from Italy. The vast majority of them are, but I think one of the things that is being imparted by writing this book is Bob's deep appreciation of architectural history and its depth of knowledge. He actually taught it at Princeton for several years as well, and so it's partly a way of justifying, I think, to those he's trying to reach that he knows what he's talking about, and by going to those obscure sources, which, by the way, 20 years after this book was done, for the next 20 years, from 1966 into the late 1980s, it was always, for many architects, trying to shinny up to the mantle of postmodernism. It was like, what, as books would come out, how obscure was the source that they were kind of delving into when they really didn't know. They were only really skimming the surface of architectural history. And so, I think, it's really about, much about that. Your interpretation is that it is a manifesto. Nobody's arguing that it isn't. We're just saying that there's multiple readings of how this book can be read, and it's very particular not only to the author, but also to the person who picks up the book and now reads it and interprets it.
Thank you, and I think we've run out of time, so this is a beautiful way to conclude. Thank you, James.
That's the end of the evening. Please join us tomorrow at 10 for the first paper session. Thank you so much for coming.